In this chapter, we will define behavioral economics and contrast the view with the neoclassical economy. But the chapter also going to relate to how prospect theory explains many consumer behavior and how time and consistency and myopia cause people to make suboptimal long-run decisions. We also, throughout the chapter, will define the fairness and give an example of how it affected behavior in the economy. The last word of the chapter will review how researchers in UK found a way to nudge people to making different choices. Okay, so the concept we will cover throughout the chapter, again, will be a systematic error, origin of behavioral economics, our efficient, error-prone brains, prospect theory, we'll review prospect theory, and myopia. We talk about that in time and consistency. And we'll conclude with fairness and self-interest that we already alluded to on the previous lecture. So everything we say from chapter 1 or chapter 2, we base it on neoclassical view of the economy. And like I said earlier, the neoclassical economies make it simpler to be able to explain the mechanism of the market, right? So we know that not just the price and the budget or the main component of people taking any particular action on the market. For you to buy something, there's a lot rolling into it. But the neoclassical make it simple for us to be able to see how the law of demand play by looking at the price and the quantity demanded. Same thing with the law of supply. So we will bring the view of behavioral economists and we'll contrast those views with the neoclassical so you guys can see the difference between them. So neoclassical economy, they believe our decisions are rational, right? They are rational. We know what we want. We are self-interest. We have a desired output. Based on that, we allocate efficiently the scarce resources we have. But the evidence shows that we make a systematic error, a repeated error. So behavioral economists try to explain why we make those errors. What is the logic behind those errors? Those are the things that we're gonna talk through this chapter. So rationality is the most point of disagreement between behavioral economists and the neoclassical economists. Behavioral economists believe that the neoclassical make a number of unrealistic assumptions on how human are, our capability and our motivation. One thing that is clearly on the neoclassical side is our rationality, right? Our rationality. So the behavioral economists put significant point on our mental process that is behind any behavior action or any action that we as a consumer we take. Improving outcome by improving decision is one of the main focus of behavioral economists. So now what I want you to take away from what we bring to the behavioral economists and contrast with a neoclassical economist view, I want you to see both as a complementary, right? One, make it clear to explain the mechanism of the market. One, go deeper to try to better understand why people behave a certain way. what is the origin of those errors. But both of them together, they try to understand, even though the neoclassical make us unrealistic assumption, make it simpler to be able to explain the mechanism of the market. The behavioral, they went a little deeper, try to understand people's behavior to be able to better explain why consumer act certain way on the market. Okay. So to that point, many economists prefer to think of neoclassical and behavioral economics as a complementary approaches, right? That can be used in conjunction to help improve our understanding of human behavior. Neoclassical believe that a consumer care greatly about prices on the market. Right? They cannot explain impulsive or impulse buying, for instance, right? If we say that we are rational and resources we have are scarce, are limited, our income is limited. So how you explain impulse buying? You go and you purchase something that you probably don't have a use for, right? Think about the majority of people. Look at your own closet. Probably the majority of people, including some people like myself, if you open your closet, you see that probably you purchase clothes or shoes that still have tag on, right? So how you explain those? If we know that we have a scarce resources that we have to use efficiently to satisfy our need or to maximize our satisfaction, how you explain the fact that you use those scarce resources to purchase something that you don't use for a year or two that still have tag on it. Okay, those are the things that the behavioral try to explain. So the behavioral economists explain impulse buying, right, and other irrational human behavior as a result of a variety of underlying factors. So put together here, this table summarize the view of the neoclassical and behavioral economists on a different topic. So you see rationality, what they say about rationality, stability of preferences, what they say about it, capability for making mental calculation, what they say about it, right? So one said that people like to calculate the accurate calculator. And the other one say, wait a minute, people are bad at math and avoid difficult computation if they can. So again, we had the ability to access future option and possibility, the strength of willpower above, say about it. You have the neoclassical view and you have the behavioral view also, the degree of selfishness, and they talk about fairness also. So I want you to take this table over here and the previous one and try to take time on it and contrast the view, and you will see that at the end, above have the same objective to better understand how we behave, why we behave a certain way on the market. So heuristic, the brain evolved many low energy mental shortcut. And this is had to do a little bit of the evolution. If you go back to antiquity, you see that our ancestor, because of the brain, need a lot of energy. And they had to find a food. And every time you go out to get a food as a predator, you also are a prey for a different type of animal. So if we go back all the way to our ancestors. So to that point, people try to conserve energy as possible. And by doing so, the mental activity it's not because we know that the brain consumes a lot of energy. So they didn't use the mental ability much, but they make a decision. So by doing so, that develop a shortcut in our brain called heuristic that help us to apply a quick decision. So these shortcuts are not the most accurate mental process option that we have, right? But it's used because of the opportunity cost, right? Opportunity cost to think through it, and it costs you a lot of energy, right? So since those heuristic are hardwired in our brain, it may be difficult for people to adapt the behavior. They have to try multiple times. And sometimes it's hard, you go, but that's why you have that systematic error. People keep doing the same error, even though you pointed out to them, that error gonna come again. That's a tendency. Our brain, the system 1 and the system 2. One be the cognitive, and the other one like emotional, I would say. So the system 1 and the system 2. The system 1 and the system 2. The system 1 is to use a lot of heuristic in order to make a decision. And the system 2 use a new part of our brain. So the system 1 is what we hit and read. The system 1 is what we inherited from our ancestor. And the system 2 is all our cognitive learning. Right? So the system 1 use heuristic, right, which is the old part of the brain. And the system 2 use the new part of our brain to undertake decision. The unconscious mental processes suffer from a variety of cognitive biases, right? Which are the misperceptions that cause systematic error. The cognitive biases, some of them that are listed here: confirmation bias that you have. We have a self-serving bias, also overconfident bias, hindsight bias, availability heuristic, planning fallacy, and the framing effect. The planning fallacy is that tendency to have massively underestimate the time needed to complete a task, for instance. Right? You have a project to deliver, right? And instead of to start working on the project from day one, you decide, well, I can do it. I wait until the last minute to do it. But by the time the project is due, you kind of realize that, well, you're going to miss the deadline because you didn't plan. You have that overconfidence, right? That planning fallacy that you have enough time, you can do it in that short. You don't need the whole time allocated to the project, but you will need a little time to do it, right? The framing effect here occurs when a change in the context causes people to react differently to a particular piece of information, right? So you have that information that push you to react differently. Availability heuristic cause people, for instance, to base their estimate about the likelihood of event to happen, not on objective fact, but on whether or not similar event come to their mind. So something that you know before, and you apply it to it. So all those biases that we have in our brain make us sometimes to make those decisions, and then when you look at it, are not rational after all, which contradict the argument of the neoclassical that put it simple that people are rational and they know what they want. How people cope with a negative possibility, right? It's a central focus of behavioral economics. Many observations have been categorized as how people actually deal with a prospect of a bad thing as well as a good thing. Right. And like, you know, the majority of people have loss aversion. Right? They put too much feeling or much emphasis on the loss than the gain. Right? So people deal with loss different than the way they deal with gains. One example that I always say is if you end up losing $100 and at the same time somebody gives you $100, you still have that pain of losing $100, even if though it's the both transaction netted to zero, we still have that feeling for the loss. So we put more emphasis on the loss than the gain. The prospect theory helps us to understand how we plan to deal with life ups and downs, how consumers deal with, we as an individual, we deal with the ups and downs that we have to face in life. To that point, the businesses had to be careful about increasing the price of their product. Because once a consumer becomes used to a given price, and when you increase that price, now they're going to feel like they are losing something from that static quo, which is the price that they used to. Right? So the challenge is that when people are used to a particular price, so that is the static quo. So once you change the price, now people are going to look at the new price as a loss to them. So we talk about the elasticity, how people feel about price change if the demand is elastic. So people the quantity purchase is gonna drop, and that automatically gonna impact your revenue. The framing effect here have a major consequence for consumer behavior, because any frame that alter whether consumer consider a situation to be a gain or a loss will affect the way the consumer will behave on the market. Okay. So endowment effect and market transaction, for instance. The endowment effect is the tendency that people had to put a higher valuation on anything that they currently own than the same thing that they do not own. So whatever they own, they put a high valuation on what they have compared to the same thing that they don't have, that they have to purchase. And the statistical bias here is a tendency that people have to favor any option that is represented to them as being the default. Right? They put emphasis on that thing that is given to them as a default opinion. So this global perspective just give you the percentage of a population consenting to be organ donor. Right? So again, if you look at that, you will see compared to the status quo, the way you portray. Look at the first two countries, for instance, that have a similar culture. Right? The survey that they had to fill out, they responded differently. It depends on how the information was presented to them. Right? People tend to stick with whatever option that is presented as a default. If it's presented to them, depending on how you phrase the survey, if it's presented to them as a default, they tend to stick with that. Right? So if you phrase a organ donor a survey as organ donor to be a default, people will go for it. But if you phrase it differently, people will probably reject it. Myopia and time and consistency. Economy use the word myopia as an analogy to that medical condition when you are near sighted, right? To describe the fact that our brain have a hard time to conceptualize the future. So we put more priority in the present than the future. Majority of us know that you have to save for your retirement. But if there's no system in place to coerce you or to help you to save, like 401k, and also penalty when you do the early withdrawal, a lot of people are not going to save, right? Because we put emphasis on the present than the future. We have a hard time to conceptualize the future. The primary consequence of myopia is when people are faced to choose between something that generates benefit quickly and something that will generate benefit in the future, right? People want something that will generate benefit quickly. The time and consistency here is the tendency to misjudge at the present time what you will want to do at some time in the future, or what you will want to do at some time in the future. And it is as if your future self end up disagreeing with the present self. And this causes a major problem to self-control. So fairness and a self-interest. We know that we all have to have that self-interest. So the neoclassical model assumes that people are purely self-interest. Right? They want something that is better for them, and they invest in that. But what behavioral economists have discovered is that human propensity to care about other. So they discover that people care more about other than the way we thought about it originally, right? While self-interest is always present, most people care deeply about others, right? And how they interact with other people. As a result, economy transactions are heavily impacted by moral and ethical factors. Today, especially with the new millennium, we know that look at the product, right? Even if the products are cheap, they will want to know who made those products, if it's a fair trade, if there's no child labor involved. So there's a lot of things that people are doing today to refer that behavior, right? They don't just because the product is cheap, are going to go and buy. They want to know how the product was made, if it's a fair trade, if people earn the wage they supposed to making those products. If there's a child labor involved, there's a lot of things that show that people care deeply about others. So our understanding of fairness and how the fact economy transaction have been reinforced and refined in recent years by looking at the games that were played, right? And the outcome suggests that people care about fairness, right? And are not purely self-interested. So these games are well detailed in the book, the dictator game, the ultimator game, and I encourage you guys to go and read those games and see the outcome of the game. The last word of this chapter, which is I talk about the UK, the UK team that use have a study nudging, for instance, toward a particular choice, right? So you can use that to nudge people toward a particular choice. But the challenge of that is people may portray that as a coerced action, force them to do something, right? You can portray as a coerce. So the key feature of nudge is that they are subtle and can cause a large change in behavior without making people feel like a bully or coerced. Without imposing a strange new rule or having to offer people a big monetary incentive or disincentive to get them to do what you want. So you can, the BIT founder UK could increase tax revenue, for instance, by mailing a letter, right, to the neighbor saying that your neighbor already paid the taxes. So by showing a household that your neighbor already paid his taxes, that probably nudge that person to also go and try to pay his taxes. And the study was done, and UK found a result that by using it, right? So the system kind of the nudging, you push people or you lead people to do action that you want them to do, and the people will do it without have that feeling like you coerce them to do that particular action. Right? It's purposely you force them to do it, but they will think like they do it on their own, right? And that can be viewed, like I was saying before, that can be viewed as coerce, not coerce, but that can be viewed as a manipulation of those people.